Hi, I'm Stina.
And I'm Father Burns.
And this is the Living Fullness podcast. On this episode, we're going to chat about the virtue of humility and how we can cultivate it, as well as the misconceptions around humility.
If you're new here on Living Fullness podcast, we chat about a whole range of topics, including, but not limited to, Christian relationships and also human flourishing. So it's great to have you join us, and we look forward to being able to serve you.
So humility. I can remember very, very early on in my sort of conscious and very active pursuit of virtue, there was a number of people, like particularly of the faith, who was trying to speak into and were speaking into my life at that point. But these people were trying to speak into my life in terms of what humility is and how do we cultivate humility. And the people that I was speaking with at the time kind of left me with the impression that humility is like one of those virtues that you don't need to worry about. And that used to grate me.
Sure.
Because here I am like actively trying to, grow in the virtues, and yet every place I would turn to, every person I turn to would be like, don't worry about that virtue. Even if we do, like, you do think about it and you do, try to actively pursue it, you're just going to fall flat on your face. So like, let's just not even go there. And that made me like super cross, particularly for someone who's like super practical, myself. Like it just made me really cross. But then as time kind of started to pass, I came to appreciate that humility actually is hard to just pin down. And there is actually a lot of misconceptions about humility as well. So I've heard lots of people talk about humility like it means that we just put ourselves last always. That's all humility means. It's just constantly putting ourselves last, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the situation is. Always put yourself last, or always think of yourself as the worst. Like it's having this negative idea of who you are, and that somehow upholding that is like, wow, I'm humble because I think I am so bad and I am so like it, all these just having all these negative ideas.
I self-flagellate, therefore I'm humble.
Like that's the way to be humble. But then I remember coming across a quote. You may know who the quote is by. I don't. I came across this quote that really summarized the virtue of humility nicely. And it was very simple. It's just that humility is not thinking of yourself as less. It's thinking of yourself less. So it's not so much the opinion that we hold of ourselves, the opinion of the esteem that we kind of have. It's not about that at all. It's actually just not focusing on us as much at all. It doesn't mean that we disregard who we are and, not care for the gift of life that we have. It doesn't mean that at all. But it's just kind of refocusing where our thought and our mind, our hearts, our gaze go away from always on ourselves and back onto something more and someone more important.
Yeah. I don't know who said that, by the way. I haven't got a clue. I've heard it many times before, but I don't know who's responsible for saying it. I
haven't got a clue. So one of the things that's really different to the misconception of humility, of constantly putting ourselves last, for example, it means that we're constantly having to assess who we are, what we have to be able to give, which keeps putting our focus back on us. Like, what do I have? Who am I? Where am I at? So even when we think about, practical ways that someone may need something, the humble person isn't looking at the person and going, right, what do I have to offer that person? The humble person is looking at the person in front of them themselves and going, what does this person need? And then just jumping in to serve without thinking too hard and too much about, but what's this going to do to me? And how much is this going to affect? Do I have that? Why am I going to look stupid if I try? What if I get in there? Am I going to make it worse? Like me all the time. And I have to be careful because I know that sometimes that can sound like, but what about prudence then? Don't we also have to be prudent? Don't those other virtues also have to come into play? Yes, they do. And we'll go into that a bit more. But I suppose at this point, it's just that humility moves our gaze away from
Right.
us and onto God, and the command that we've been given by God. Just love God, love neighbor.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep, absolutely. So the point you make is interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, someone might hear what you just said there and go, well, hang on. In the Gospels, Jesus says that to take the lower seat. Don't take the higher seat. Take the lower seat.
Yep.
And to that he who tries to be first of all will be last of all, and he who is last of all will be first of all. So how when we think about that, the question might be, well, how does the vision of humility that we're presenting match with that gospel? And because this is a question that we didn't discuss before the actual podcast, I tended to go one or two ways with this. Just to go, so Stina, would you answer that for us, please?
I can give you a thought and then you can build on it if you
like. Rock on, let's do that.
My thought would be, yes, take the last seat insofar as don't look to take the highest place that's been set out. You show up at a dining table, invited over by friends, don't look to take, the head of the table. Look for, if you can, the lowest seat. But just because Jesus said, that particular, I can't re-quote what the verse.
When you go to a banquet, take the lowest seat. Do not take the high seat.
Right. So just because he said that, if you then show up to the dinner party and go, no, I must sit in this seat. Jesus said, I must sit in the lowest seat. No, I will fight you. I must sit in this low. Because then everybody's gaze is back on you.
Right.
That's not humility at all.
Right.
So at some point we have to go, well, actually maybe somebody has taken that lowest seat and I need to take the next seat that's available to me. Maybe the humblest thing to do is to go, my interior disposition is, yes, I would like to take the lowest seat, but Lord, that has already been taken. So let me take what's available.
Yep.
And not even make a thing of it.
Yep. So I think that's a terrific answer.
Okay.
That's a terrific answer. I feel no need to build on that whatsoever. It's a terrific
this is
answer.
Unusual.
That's great. The other interesting point that comes up for me is that I always think about when it comes to humility and pride and that sort of thing, I can't help but think about J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
Sauron, who's the big baddie, is depicted as a floating, all-seeing eye.
Yeah.
It's attached to this gaudy, big black tower stuff. And the eye is always looking outwards, right? It's always looking, it never looks inward. Its greatest weakness, in fact, is that it never looks inwards. And as a result, Sauron never has an accurate assessment of what he needs, right? Of the danger that his enemies pose to him. Nor does he see that in the end, despite all his efforts, he's going to fail. Pride blinds him to all this simply because he will not look inward. And as a result, he has this skewed perception of what he sees outward. And this is essential to humility. The ability to look inward and recognize our lack as being our lack of virtue or our lack of love or our lack of of ability or our lack of whatever is indicative of our need for God. One of the things that really bugs me today is the phrase that's so often dandied around, "You are enough."
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, well, hang on. What does that mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Because, I mean, does it mean that God loves you and that you know who you are in the eyes of God, in the words of St. Eugene de Mazenod? I think we should be very happy that I quoted him. And is that what it means? If so, hey, cool. But if it means, no, you're enough to make you happy. Well, I'm sorry, sunshine.
Yeah.
No, you're not.
No.
We're lacking something. We're lacking God, right? So to be able to look inward and see, on my own, I'm not enough to make me happy. On my own, I'm not enough to make this other person happy. In fact, I can't make this other person happy. So God has to be the one that steps in here. And so if we're able to look inwards, recognize our need for God, and recognize that our gifts are from God. The good things that we see when we look inside aren't our own. They're also gifts from God. And we also, when we look inward, recognize that other people are our brothers and sisters who we're called to serve appropriately with the gifts that God has given to us. So when we look interiorly, we see a need for God. We see a need to thank God for the good things that he's given to us. And we see a duty that's written on our hearts to be in relationship with others in an appropriate way. But all of that banks on the reality that we're able to see where I stand honestly in relation to God and others.
Thinking about what you just said, there is something that's a bit different about the virtue of humility when we compare it to the other virtues.
Yep.
And I think that's what, like when I think about the people that was trying to speak into my life very early on, I think that's what they were trying to get at, and I just didn't get it. That there's a different approach. Like I have to have a different way of thinking about approaching humility to the way that I would for, say, courage. And the reason for that is because with some of the other virtues, we just have to put in a little bit more human effort.
Yep.
Like with the virtue of courage, yeah, okay, we have to think about it. Yes, we have to pray and discern if, there is a particular move that God wants us to make. But really, all we have to do is face the thing that makes us frightened. That's a little bit of extra human effort.
Yep.
And the same for, other things like patience, for example. Like, okay, I can plan for this particular moment, this particular person frustrates me, or I get really frustrated when people cut me off as I'm driving, something like that. Okay, well, the next time that happens, the plan I make is I will take 3 breaths, I will pray for that person to God in that moment. Like that's my plan, a little bit of extra human effort.
I'll beep the horn loudly.
Less loudly. I'll beep it 2 and 3 times. No, I don't have road rage. But even for things like discernment, right?
Yeah.
Like a little bit of extra human effort would look like I'm going to source the people that I go to ask questions, to ask for them to share their wisdom, to share their experience with us, things like that. But the thing with humility is that the further we dig into trying to find these practical human effort ways of growing in that virtue, the more we end up relying on our own ability, which is what you were referring to before. We end up relying on our own ability, our own strength, what we can do, which all that is doing is just growing the muscle of pride.
Pretty much.
That already has a place in most, if not all of our lives anyway. It's not helping us grow in humility at all, because the whole crux of humility is the recognition, what you just said before, that we depend entirely on God, not just in some occasions, but in absolutely everything. We depend entirely on him.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so in that kind of way, it almost feels like humility almost becomes like a fruit. Almost becomes a fruit of like a life of love and of living out the virtues, as opposed to, I'm not saying it is, but I'm just saying it feels almost like it could be like just, one of those fruits that come from trying to be more like Christ. And yet at the same time, you can't really be like Christ without the virtue of humility.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, that it's almost like a fruit, right? That it's like something that springs from charity, right? And yes, it's its own sort of virtue, but I think we often talk about the virtues as being related to each other, right? So it's not at all surprising that we should say the virtue of humility springs from the virtue of charity, that when we allow God to love us and we really bring our minds and hearts to wanting to serve God, that the effect of that is, well, we actually start thinking of him as the most important person in our lives. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. A friend of mine says that his first book title will be How I Mastered Humility. And
love it.
Yeah. Now obviously that's a joke.
I feel like I've heard that before. I don't know who it is, but I feel like I've heard that. Yeah, okay.
I won't.
Okay.
It's obviously a joke. And it indicates exactly what you're saying, that the growing in humility is not about the actions that I take, right? But my willingness to admit that in spite of all of my activity, I stand in complete and total need of God. Despite all my gifts, I am not enough for another person's life, nor my own life for that matter. Yeah. I need God to satisfy my human heart. This isn't to say that there's nothing that we can do to grow in humility. When we work on the other virtues, we are growing in humility, right? Since we recognize that there is a good that my life ought to be aimed at, which is greater than any of us and which sets the perfect benchmark at which I cast my eyes, with the full understanding that this side of the veil, I will never accomplish that benchmark, right? I will never reach perfection this side of heaven, right? And here on earth, I will always need to grow in the perfection, growing towards the fullness of Christ. Truthfully, any attitude that says I can grow in any virtue on my own and on my own terms is completely lacking in humility and not growing towards humility or any virtue for that matter. And it's why humility is, in some ways, it's a requisite for real genuine growth in the virtues, because a requisite of growing in virtue is a reliance on God and an experience of God's love, which leads us to glorify him and to seek to connect with others in a way which reflects his glory, not ours.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess this is why the humble Christian isn't one who's actively looking for ways to act humbly. That's not their goal. That's not their outset. They're humble because they live a life of love for God and for neighbor, and they live that through the virtues. So, they're selfless, they're generous, they're patient, they're courageous, they're docile to the Spirit, all of those things. But it's also all of those things that make them humble.
Right.
It's that connection that you're talking about as well. And it's not just it's not one action, and it's not even a cluster of behaviors. It's almost like a state of being that kind of flows, that wellspring you were thinking of, talking about before, that flows from a life of virtue. And it's also what makes this virtue so attractive. It's what makes this virtue so beautiful, but also so challenging.
Right.
At the same time. And so if you almost want to look at the secret for cultivating humility and the only action plan, which is what I was looking for at the very start, the only action plan that you can have is to just stay focused on being totally dependent on God.
Yeah. Yep.
And his grace.
Yep.
That's it. Just depend on that. And then just love him and love your neighbor, because that's what he's asked you to do.
Right.
Just that.
Right.
Just nothing else.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. You had some really insightful stuff there on humility, and we hope that you've been able to pick something up there from us on this virtue, and that together we might be able to keep on the Christian journey and keep on not trying to grow in humility.
Leave it to God to grow.
Leaving it to God to grow in humility. Right.
Leave it to God to grow.
I like
in that.
it. I like
We'll
it.
just love him, do what he's asked us to do,
Cool.
and leave it to him.
Cool. All right.
So before we end, truth, beauty, and goodness.
The bishop and my fellow priests in Wagga. So at the moment, I am in let's call it an undesirable situation. The undesirable situation is that I am the only non-retired priest at the cathedral. There's a couple of retired men who give me a helping hand here and there, but obviously they're in their retirement, in their old age, they're very limited as to what they can do. But I have no assistant, and I'm trying to run the cathedral on my own, and that's a real challenge. And there are people coming, which is great. That's going to, this is not going to be forever.
Thank goodness.
And I know that, so that's good. But it doesn't make this period any simpler. But Bishop and my brother priests are really trying to pick up slack where they can, and it's been really awesome to see that take place. So many thanks to the goodness that Bishop and my brother priests have been imaging to me.
Aww. Yeah. How beautiful.
And what about yourself?
For me this week, because of the episode topic that we've had, the resource I would love to recommend is actually called Humility, Wellspring of Virtue.
Cool.
It's by Dietrich von Hildebrand. I haven't finished it, but so far it's really good. And it's one of those ones that I've actually referred back to on several occasions. One, like you kind of read a little bit and then you have to kind of sit on it, live life with it.
Sure.
For you to kind of learn what's there. Well, that's been my experience, to learn what's there and then go back and go, okay, I've lived that. I now understand what you're talking about here. Now let me read the next section.
Yeah.
So it's been one that I've kind of journeyed with. And as people know, with every book recommendation I've ever made on this podcast, I don't do big books. So it's only a little book, like physically little and also like really short. So yeah, can recommend. Go have a read.
Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us for our first episode of season 5 on the Living Fullness podcast. We hope that you've enjoyed this and we will see you again next week. But until then, love, light and bless.
God bless.